我哋嘅工作人員請返阿湯生。
Now we will now invite Mr. Tong to come back into the meeting room. Can the staff please invite members to quickly return to the meeting room? Members, we resume the hearing. If I may just remind members again, throughout the proceeding, there must be 4 members at least present before we could continue with the proceedings. If I may also remind members that you should try not to repeat issues for which answers have been given systematically by the PAC or the Independent Review Committee in their report. Thank you. Ms. Sitho. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first make a declaration about my capacity. Now, I find out today that Ms. Wendy Young is here. She's a friend that I haven't met for a long time. And I would undertake that before the report is out, I would have no social contact with Ms. Young. I must make sure that. Now, I'll come to my questions, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Tong was the commissioner of ICAC. He reported directly to the chief executive. During his term, Mr. Tong, how did you report to the chief executive, and how did the chief executive monitor your work? Yes, Mr. Tong. Mr. Chairman, let me answer the member's question. During my term, about my contact with the chief executive, there were meetings, there were correspondences, and through phone calls, he might ask me questions or give me directions. Apart from the meetings I mentioned, there was another occasion, the Executive Council meeting. The Commissioner of ICAC regularly gave report to the EXCO on the work of the ICAC. There were several committees appointed by the Chief Executive and that were related to the ICAC. Through the work of these committees and through meetings of these committees and other meetings, there were reports, and on other occasions there were also reports made.
Ms. Ho, thank you, Chairman. About the contact correspondences and phone contact to with the Chief Executive, how frequent were they? And what were they about? If it's within the scope of investigation, you don't need to disclose them. We understand. What about those related to your official business? For example, we see in the IRC report and the PAC report points being made about on 4 occasions during your duty visits without CE's approval, air passages were prepared by your staff, and documentation in this regard was issued. And on the change of your itinerary, you did not inform the chief executive. So, in what way did you report these matters to the chief executive? Mr. Tong. I understand the focus of the members' question is on entertainment and duty visits, and on duty visits, approval would be sought from the chief executive on duty visits. A prescribed form would be used stating the details of the visit for the chief executive's information. And we would also talk on the phone, and I would notify the chief executive of the important matters involved. So I don't think Mr. Tong is answering my question. You just repeat that you would do that by way of a form. But my question just now was, without the CE's approval, you internally issued air passages in advance. If you followed internal guidelines properly, you should not have issued air passages. And afterwards, did you report to the chief executive that without his approval, you had already issued air passages? Mr. Tong, Chairman, on why air tickets were issued before the CE was given its approval, before the IRC report, I did not have any knowledge of this matter. I have no recollection either. As for when the air tickets were issued, it wasn't the focus of my work, so I might not be aware of the details. And I recall that this point was also raised at the Public Accounts Committee. Procedurally, after receiving the CE's approval, my assistant would immediately forward this approval to the administration branch, the finance office, for the procurement of air passages, and they would be responsible to take this on. And I don't recall, in short, whom, during what time, issued what air tickets. As for why air tickets were issued before approval was given, I cannot recall any discussion. I can't explain it. Air tickets were not issued under my arrangement. Ms. Ho, as the ICAC Commissioner, apart from anti-corruption work, in terms of administration and operations, Mr. Tong was also the person ultimately responsible for all these matters. It was non-compliant if you issued air tickets before the CE's approval was given. In particular, since you did not know about your itinerary, do you agree that since you're the person responsible for administration and operations of the ICAC, there was misconduct on your part? Chairman, what I knew was that according to the IRC report, there were 4 occasions on which air tickets were issued on my behalf without CE's approval, or before CE's approval was sought. As for the procedures involved, I did not know the details. As the ICAC Commissioner, as to whom I would get in contact with and the procedures involved, I think we need to set out all the details on what happened and what were involved. According to the information at hand, I cannot make a judgment on my general responsibilities on this matter. But I agree that as the ultimately responsible person of this commission, the head of the commission should be responsible for any administrative decision made. As for there was any negligence on my part, or whether I should be responsible, I can quote another example. In the IRC report, they mentioned that there was a wrong entry made by a staff, and that had nothing to do with me. So, in relation to Mr. Tong's duty visits, and on more than one occasion, your subordinate did not comply with the requirements, and I believe you could not shift your responsibility. And Mr. Tong, you said that you would contact the chief executive by phone. And what were the phone conversations about? If it falls within the scope of investigation, please don't disclose them to us. We have no interest in that. My question is whether those phone conversations with the chief executive had to do with the administration of the commission, for example, on the receipt of gifts, whether there were any direct phone conversations in this regard, because you mentioned that on retaining gifts, you also made some applications. Mr. Tong. I recall that verbally I did not make such applications. They had nothing to do with phone conversations. Forms had to be filled in. As for contact with the chief executive, they had to do with official business, but not limited only to investigation, but also to anti-corruption and community relations and publicity work. All within the scope of work of the ICAC, and also at one time there was a topic much discussed about surveillance and interception of communication, and also any business related to the ICAC. Ms. Ho, during Mr. Tong's five-year term, did the chief executive ever inquire into anything about your duty visits and entertainment? Mr. Tong, Chairman. Now, my understanding is quite general. There were inquiries on duty visits, but not on official entertainment. So in your recollections, there were questions asked. So can you tell us what scope these questions fell into? Now, Chairman, you said that some remarks were made at the PAC meeting hearing, and that there were remarks made on a Guangxi trip, which were made at the PAC hearing. And I recall, and I know that there was a change of itinerary, and this point was made both in the IRC report and the PAC report. And when you yourself for the ICAC apply for a duty visit and seek approval from the chief executive, there was no mentioning of your visit to Lijiang and Loshan. And what do you think was your role and your responsibility in this regard? there were detailed records at the PAC hearings. And I think several points stem from the PAC discussions. The most prominent being that in relation to application for the Chief Executive's approval for overseas duty visits, if the ICAC Commissioner applied to visit a certain province covering certain destinations, and if those destinations were not specified whether it's against the rules, my understanding is that it's not against the rules. I can cite an example for members' reference. Back then, the PAC did not have the opportunity to discuss this point. The PAC requested the ICAC to provide an information to look at how my predecessor made such application. And I think this could be made available if members so wish to have this document. And I read this document in relation to a duty visit to a certain province. And during the several-day visit, the commissioner visited different cities. And I think it's similar to the scenario mentioned by the honourable member. And about Loshan, Lijiang, after thorough discussions, I think the message was that the ICAC officer changed the itinerary due to some changes at the very late stage. It wasn't the case that we changed the itinerary at the very early stage without telling the Chief Executive. There was no concealment. Ms. Ho, my question is, when you make the application, you did not specify a province. If you specify, say, Yunnan in your application, and that you would visit destinations in Yunnan, that is understandable. But in your application, you specify certain destinations, and apart from these specific destinations, you visited some other places. Then did you have this awareness that you should make such declarations as well? Mr. Tong. When I make the application, I had in mind the area to be covered for official business, and subsequently there were changes and special arrangements were made, but I did not think that the nature of the duty visit, that is for official business, was affected. The arrangements were not satisfactory, but I did not find it necessary to report to the Chief Executive of these changes, because these changes, in my view, did not affect the purpose and of the duty visit and the effect. The Chief Executive was very busy. I didn't think it necessary to inform him of these matters. Ms. Ho, I note that Mr. Tong's answers confirm that according to present standards, what happened in the past were not desirable and improvements could be made. But the ICAC Commissioner had the discretions, and the ICAC Commissioner only reported to the Chief Executive. Back then, you did not see a problem. But now, from public opinions, it's clear that the public doesn't accept such behavior. I wish to remind that members should refrain from making personal comments in this session. We should ask questions for the witness to clarify some facts. Ms. Ho, please continue. I just repeated Mr. Tong's views. So my question for Mr. Tong is this. Now, in relation to the accountability and monitoring between you and the chief executive, was it sufficient? If you had no idea that air tickets were issued before CE's approval was given, and the CE had no idea that the itinerary was changed, then would you think that the checks and balances were adequate? Mr. Tong, may I be given a minute to clarify before I answer? The honourable member said she just repeated my view, and may I express my view now. At different times, due to different needs and considerations, there were different policies. Now, the honourable member said that there were grievances in the community. I think this is just the member's comment. Whether it was adequate or not, in terms of the work relations between me and the chief executive and the communications, I think that it was adequate. Now, you said the chief executive was very busy. He might not tend to trivial matters like the issuance of air tickets. But did the chief executive know that without his approval, air tickets were already issued to you? Mr. Tong, I can say with some certainty that he had no idea, because not even myself had any idea. Ms. Ho, how many questions do you still have? Because you can wait for a second round. This is the final question in relation to the chief executive. Now, we confirmed some facts just now, and in reports released earlier, we understood that before CE's approval, you already did certain things, and I mean some things had been done, and you had no idea, the chief executive had no idea, so what can we do to improve the system? Now, about the things done by me before the CE had given his approval, as mentioned by the honourable member, I reiterate that I did not issue the air tickets on my own initiative. Any improvements necessary? Of course, once discovered, improvements had to be made. Under this mechanism, were there checks and balances, and what were the responsibilities? In fact, the FSTB had this procurement unit, and I'm not saying that no improvement was necessary. I agree that on knowing these matters, we should improve the situation.
Now, when the Treasury saw that it was not in line with the regulation, did anyone tell you as the Commissioner, or did anyone tell the Chief Executive that there was already one breach, so improvement must be made so there wouldn't be the following 3 breaches? Mr. Tong, in my term, as far as I could remember, I did not hear any objection or complaint or anything was pointed out. In my recollection, I did not come across any suggestion to make improvements. And what the Treasury did in terms of auditing and so on, I was not aware of it. I just knew that there was the mechanism for someone to carry out audit. Next, Dr. Priscilla Leung. And in the second round, we will have Mr. Dennis Kwok. Just now, the Deputy Chairman made a declaration. In attendance, she knows someone here. Well, any social function is possible, but during the social functions, there is no, there should be no discussion or commenting on the case. Doesn't mean that you couldn't have any social contact. No, it's not the case. Dr. Priscilla Leung. Now, this select committee wants to find some very different points of views, and then that of the PC is actually a difficult task. in paragraph 61 of the PAC report, there's something mentioned, and members just now asked about the CPPCC issue. In the report, you said you personally denied the allegation, and you stressed that when there are entertainment functions with any other departments is to promote the anti-corruption work of the ICAC. And after you became the commission, it was only 6 months after you retired that someone talked to you about such issues. Now about mainland officials and overseas officials, you mentioned that in your reply. Since 1993, I started giving talks for ICAC. The mainland was very much interested in the achievements of the ICAC in its anti-corruption work. They really would like to see whether they could learn anything. Now, in 1996, there was an internal guideline issued for all entertainments. They must be conducted on an organizational basis. From 1996 to 2013, last year, on the question of entertainment, I'm sure, well, there would be another review, but in 1996, against what background was there such a suggestion made? That's the first point. Second point, I'm sure you, your colleagues, looking back, wouldn't want to do this again, you know, having got yourselves into so much trouble. Beef brisket, fish straws, first time I heard about them, I wondered why they were on the list. But then if you see that they actually gave you lychee, now maybe some issues were not discussed, and so I want to raise this point, because we may have to see how we want to revise the regulations. Now, on the mainland, the most sincere form of mediation or conciliation is not about paying with money. It's about giving chickens, tangerines, and so on. That's the most sincere way of a conciliation. So maybe that's why so here there's fishbowl and beef brisket. How did it come about? Because in Hong Kong, it's not our customs. Food, of course, costs, you know, like fish food balls and briskets, beef briskets, they don't cost very much. So now I want to know more about this. Now reports have been issued. That was one point. Another point, you said there was code of conduct, discretion, and so on. Times might change too. In exchanges with the mainland on these 4 areas. First, the bestowing of gifts on gifts that could be kept. Now for gifts with a value of more than $1,000, they're considered special. Do you think that all such discretion should be removed from now on so that colleagues wouldn't be caught again? So you would make it very clear that in future there won't be no discretion. It's the same arrangement for all. It's more or less like mechanical. So nobody needs to waste time or show the responsibility. Dr. Leung, you're asking questions. So please ask simple questions. If you come up with so many questions, it's very difficult. Yes, I can understand that. I take your suggestion, Mr. Chairman. The first question, please. Mr. Chairman, I was starting to become overwhelmed by the questions. Thank you, member, for focusing on one question. Fishball, beef briskets, I'll choose to answer that one first. At the PAC meeting, other members asked same question in a different way. So that's why I have a better memory of that, and it was also in a verbatim transcript. Now, the first time there was a discussion about duty visits, and someone raised this point. This issue is about official liaison and contact. We recall people sent us, the other party sent us lychee and longan, and so we said we should send something similar. But of course, in Hong Kong, we don't produce lychee and longan, and this was suggested, and people said, "Oh, yes, good idea." So the decision was made. But then it was later I heard from the radio station there was a joke. Yes, at the time it's true. Longan and lychee are both round in shapes, but at the time actually it wasn't even considered. I don't know if I've got this question correctly about our exchanges with the mainland. On frequent exchanges, liaison, and so on, the evolution of such activities, do you refer to the period from 2006 to 2013 or from 1996 to 2013? Mr. Chairman, from 1996 to 2013, the whole period. You mentioned there's a code of conduct, there are laws, there's established practices, and there's also discretion and also changing times. So in your investigation work or work in relation to the ICAC where you exercise discretion, we're not asking about that. Now, for 6 years, I was one of the committee, members of the Community Relations Department. Here, we talk about exercising discretion, whether the consideration was proper and whether there was misjudgment. Now, after this case, would you agree that for all such discretion that has nothing to do with case investigation, maybe it should be dealt with specifically, so there won't be a recurrence of such incidents? From 1996 to 2013, established practice. Do you think that is working well? There was no need to change it? Because in 1996, the rules were set. I wanted to know what the background was to that change. And then from 1996 to 2013, now there is a review. It maybe it's decided there's no need to make any changes. Now, in your own work experience, would you say that it would cause difficulties to colleagues doing their work? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, member, for your elaboration. First point, I agree to some recent reports. The ICAC in May 2016 issued a document, and then there was also the audit report. After it was published, there were changes to the rules, and I agree to such changes. I think it's good. Then it's now better defined for and easier for people to follow. In the past, in the guidelines, well, as was mentioned twice today, when it comes to bestowing of gifts, there are no specific guidelines, so it's good to have guidelines. On discretion, my view is this. Now, it's my personal view. I do not believe the discretion should be removed completely. As a head of a department, there's a need for duty visits and entertainment. If there is no such need, then there wouldn't be any amendments to the regulations now. Discretion is to consider the prevailing circumstances, and I think such discretion should be kept. And as we keep the discretion, at the same time, we enhance the transparency in exercising the discretion. We enhance the accountability in exercising the discretion. That is, we enhance the overall monitoring is good. But it doesn't mean we should take away the discretion altogether. Can I make another point, please, because I think it's important. From 1996 to 2013. Now, I only worked in the ICAC for 5 years, but for that period, the whole government, including the ICAC, including the department I served, and in terms of also in terms of the working relationship with the mainland, there were changes. So it's in the light of policy consideration then, and the policy to promote the work that might have influenced some of the decisions then, including decisions on entertainment and duty visits.
Now, on duty visits and entertainment, now, my question for the former ICAC Commissioner is, if you set down the requirements in greater details, would it facilitate your work? Well, I very often work on the mainland, and sometimes you might not know where they would bring you to visit. For example, in Chengdu, you might, after a seminar, might be brought to a place for visit. You might be taken on to coach. It might not be part of the official program. So, were there any specific guidelines on, say, whether those staff members should pay for their own expenses or not? Because even if the admission was $90, that's money, and should you be so specific, or should that be a rule stating that if no advance notice was given, you should not go ahead to the visit, so as not to bother the chief executive, that is, not to participate in those visits which were not part of the official program? And if such requirements were made in advance, would it be better? Because of coach fares, well, that is part of the expenses, and also admissions, and also meal expenses. Should all the details be set out in advance, or should the Commissioner delegate such tasks to the CRD? Mr. Tong. My response is this: whether we should make the rules clearer on the whole, they should be revised to enhance clarity. I totally support it. Let me cite an example. The LegCo discussed at length in relation to the splitting of bills for purchasing wine, whether that practice was appropriate, and even after the release of the report, there were still different interpretations. It was considered the established practice by the CRD, and had there been a very clear different definition on how the bills should be splitted, whether and had there been clear rules to follow, that would have been a good idea. And had all those been done, then I'm afraid I would not have to meet Chairman, your good self here. And if between the ICC Commissioner and the Chief Executive, everything had to be reported, every destination had to be reported, and any last-minute changes had to be reported. Say, if the Commissioner was invited to visit another place just 15 kilometers away, it would be too much trouble. And I think it depends on the needs and whether there would be implementation difficulties. But in principle, to tighten up the monitoring, it's a good idea. Whether a broad brush approach should be taken, then I think it might not be beneficial to enhancing work efficiency, and it's difficult to implement. Dr. Leung, the ICAC Commissioner has very important duties, including prosecution duties. It might not be easy to set out all the details of the itinerary. So in terms of division of work, would some tasks be delegated to the CRD on the Commissioner's discretion, so that only important matters should be escalated to the Commissioner, whereas for general matters, these should be dealt with by the Community Relations Department because it's part of the official social function. Well, I wish to stop you here. I hope that members could phrase their questions more directly to the witness attending for an answer instead of making her own comments. I'm sorry, Chairman, this is not my comment. Dr. Leung, please allow me to continue. This is not a comment. I haven't finished. I want to remind everyone, and secondly, Mr. Tong, in answering the question, please answer the question instead of, for example, citing examples on entertainment and hard liquor. I hope you could answer the question more accurately. So a reminder for all. Now we have this PAC report here. It's difficult for the Select Committee not to repeat questions in the PAC report, and this reminder should be given to all members. A question just now was posed on paragraph 61, and you'll allow that question. And I think it's very important in terms of any revision in the future. When you revise the rules, and I haven't finished my question, should there be any revision to narrow the scope of discretion so that tasks could be delegated to the CRD, and it's up to them to decide during duty visits to the mainland whether you should go or not, and it's part of diplomatic it's diplomatic matters, and so that the ICC Commissioner did not need to spend time in dealing with these matters. For example, on the consumption of Mao Tai or liquor, how much should we pay? I think these should be delegated to the CRD to decide instead of troubling the Commissioner over these trivial matters. Dr. Leung, you were just making comments. No, I'm asking whether he think it's appropriate because he had the experience and he took the responsibility now, and it's not up to you to make this judgment. Please give the former ICC Commissioner this opportunity because the future Commissioner may not have experience of these series of matters. All right, Mr. Tong. Following this 2-minute discussion, I can give a clear and brief reply. If a better clarity on the division of work can be done internally so that everyone knows what their responsibilities are, then in relation to the exercising of discretion by the ICC Commissioner, I think it will be very beneficial to all. I am not saying that the Commissioner should not have any responsibility. That's not my understanding. But I agree that there should be better delineation of work, and I support it. At different times, there are different approaches. On discretion, I think some discretion should be retained, and it should be enhanced. I mean, it should be better reined in. As for future practices, I think the most important thing is to have clear rules. Because if we have clear rules, everyone would know what the rules are, and when rules permit, you can exercise discretion. If rules don't permit, you would be you would not be complying with the rules. So there should be better clarity. Dr. Leung, last question on the purchase of food items and wine and Mao Tai. These were controversial. Would you agree that in the future these should be prohibited so that your colleagues won't get into trouble? Mr. Tong. I think if we expressly prohibit the purchase of Mao Tai or other items, this could prevent or actually eliminate any possibility of our colleagues falling into the gray area or stepping across the line. In terms of operations, this is a facilitation measure. However, there are different policy considerations. Would there be circumstances in which things were not done simply because colleagues were afraid of breaching the rules? If there are clear rules, it's better for everyone to follow. But if there is no flexibility at all, there might be some constraint on the promotion of work. Mr. Paul Chair, just now, we have this impression that there didn't seem to be any express rules on the bestowing of gifts. Is that what you mean, Mr. Tong? This is what I mean. This is also reflected in the remarks made by the Commissioner to the Legislative Council. In 1996, the ICAC formulated a policy on the giving of gifts, and what is your understanding, Mr. Tong, about the 1996 policy or the 1996 notice? It was later incorporated into the CSO, the standing orders on the receipt of gifts. So, to take from your point, Mr. Tong, what is the meaning to the ICAC colleagues, including yourself, by incorporating the notice into the CSO? Mr. Tong, the Commission standing orders seeks to regulate the ICAC officers' conduct. Is it binding? It is. And you yourself was responsible for formulating the CSOs and responsible for its enforcement. Right. Mr. Tong, your understanding seemed to suggest that the standing orders only relate to the receipt of gifts. Is that correct? What I mean was that after 1996, the stipulations in the Commission standing orders related to the receipt of gifts, and it was put under the heading of receipt of gifts. So, Mr. Tong, are you saying again that this CSO doesn't relate to the bestowing of gifts? Mr. Tong, that's not what I said, because after repeated discussions, I could find two places where the bestowing of gifts were mentioned. So I cannot say that it only relates to the receipt of gifts. I could find two places in it. Well, so this version is not the same as the version you gave 2 minutes ago when you were asked about your understanding on the matter of gifts in the CSOs. Well, I am very sensitive about the discrepancy or inconsistencies, because I don't think there is any inconsistency or discrepancy, because I don't have any new ideas. But from reading the papers, I have a better idea and clearer observations. I'm referring to the Commission standing orders in relation to the provisions about receipt of gifts. There are a lot of details. I'm referring to, and this is the fourth time I'm mentioning it, the remarks made by Commissioner Pei to the panel on security. And that paper, I can give the paper number starting with Jan to the Secretariat to the Select Committee afterwards. As I mentioned, there are 4 points. The ICAC set down rules on the receipt of gifts based on the CSB circular. There was no rule on the bestowing of gifts. And on the purchase of gifts, considerations might be given based on the occasions, the standing of guests, and the meaning of gifts. This is not inconsistent or contradiction. And I'll stop here. Mr. Chair. Mr. Tong, my question is not about your understanding after the incident or how you interpreted Mr. Simon Pear's remarks. My question is on your understanding when you were former commissioner of the ICAC on the CSO's regulations on the bestowing of gifts. Mr. Tong, when I was the commissioner, I think what's important is the approach to certain questions. At different times, there were different approaches. It's not easy to talk about all of these now. The important is what rules were applicable at the time. When there were rules at the time, those rules should be followed. If there were no explicit rules or orders, then the established practice should be followed.
I'll give you another chance to clarify it. When you were in office, were you clear about whether there were any restrictions on bestowing of gifts in the CSO? Now, you went on and on, but you didn't answer the question. Now, as the most senior person in charge of the CSO, did you know whether there were any regulations on bestowing of gifts? Did you know it or not? That's all. Well, the member, if you're asking about whether there are any provisions on the selection of gifts, the value and so on, my understanding is there were no regulations. So what is your understanding? What was regulated then? My understanding was it depends on the occasion and whether there's a need. If there's no need, it's best not to give any gifts. But if there's a need to give gifts, because it will help our work, then there would be the arrangement to give gifts. Well, yes, that makes sense, what you said, but you didn't mention this point that there were 2 regulations that on exchange of gifts that should be kept to a minimum, and if exchange of goods could not be avoided, then there should be bestowing of gifts on an organizational basis, not on an individual basis. It seems that you totally forgot about the 2 provisions. Did you know it or not, actually? Well, in the CSO, actually, it reflected more than 2 points. That's what I think. If you wish, I could point out the other point, too, on keeping gifts to a minimum. The word used was policy, if I recall correctly. Now, I have the provisions now, but I wouldn't waste time looking it up. In reality, when government departments had exchanges with other parties, there was the arrangement of sending gifts, and in the ICAC, there was a store of ICAC souvenirs for giving to others. There's plenty of such souvenirs, actually. And there were gifts sent out. So on duty visits, of course, you're not concerned about rubbers given to the public. You're talking about government officials. Now, by external liaison, that means contact with other parties, and whether there's a need to exchange gifts. If there is need, then we'll make the preparation. Mr. Chair. Mr. Tong, please focus on the question. It's straightforward. Now, you mentioned the CSO, the Commission Standing Orders. In 1996, there was circular number 23, is an internal circular of the ICAC. And this circular was eventually incorporated formally into the CSO, and you are in charge of enforcing the CSO. Now, in the CSO, as I mentioned just now, there's the need to keep gifts to a minimum, and gifts should be given on the basis of organization to organization. But it seems that you were totally oblivious to that. Mr. Tong, I cannot agree to the last sentence said by the member. I believe it is an inappropriate this representation. CSO, apart from what the member said, now the policy. The policy is that it's not restriction, but it's about giving gifts to keeping it to a minimum. That's a policy that's to reflect the basic principle. But in the CSO, there's another place where there's mention of gifts. Now, I don't think it's appropriate for me to spend much time saying that, but then that brings up another concept, that is the social customs of reciprocating. That's part of the considerations. It should also be based on common sense. In other words, keeping exchange of gifts to a minimum, yes, that's a policy, but this is not the entirety of the policy consideration. That's the first point. Second point, in reality, yes, the member pointed that out right. In 1996, there was the circular. Between 1996 and 2007, was it the case that there were no gifts sent? Gifts were still given. And from the store of gifts and souvenirs, that it could be reflected that there were still gifts bestowed. And in terms of the established practice, it's not just the ICAC. Other government departments had the same understanding. And there was a certain number of gifts given away by the ICAC without my involvement too. Mr. Chair, Mr. Tong, I don't know if you're actually playing dumb or you're really dumb, because you've still been beating around the bush. Now, in 1996, there was this policy. Eventually, in 1996, became the CSO. We agreed on it. But now you go back on policy, and then you went on to say a lot of things not relevant to the CSO. I'll give you one more opportunity to clarify this. After 1996, the policy became the CSO. Is the CSO under you? Do you know the scope of the CSO and where it applies, and do you comply with the CSO? Mr. Tong. Well, the member, the public heard what the member said. I took exception to the first sentence of the member. The member asked whether I was playing dumb or I was silly. The assumption was this person was either dumb or playing dumb, but both are not right. I think these assumptions are improper. The member asked after it was incorporated in CSO in 1996, it's been in operation all these years. Do I know what's going on? Now, between 1996 and my assumption of office and my term of office, there were some 11 years. In those 11 years, there were duty visits, there were exchange of gifts by departments and the commissioner. That was the general practice. That became the general practice. Now, the commissioner represents the ICAC, other heads of department represents other departments. That's become the general practice. And these considerations relevant to what the member asked, they also reflect the view of at the time. So you couldn't just target a particular person. On my own understanding of provisions and regulations. Now, as the most senior person of the ICAC, I can't say that because there's a CSO, then I should fully understand the CSO like the back of my hand, but of course I should know fully the spirit of the CSO. How come I cannot know the CSO like the back of my hand? Because as I said, there's division of labor and there are different departments responsible for different aspects. So now on issues that I am not certain about, then what I would do is I would consult those with more experience than me, colleagues, with more experience than me, and that's when I get knowledge. Mr. Tong, are you saying that at the time you did not know the CSO like the back of your hand? That's why when you executed it, you made mistakes? On every detail of the CSO, did I actually know it like the back of my hand? I would say at least I would not be able to recite all the words of the CSO. Or I wouldn't say that I would know the CSO accurately without any mistakes, but because I work together with my colleagues in executing the CSO, I think I would say I believe I should know the spirit of the CSO very well. Mr. Chair, well, I mentioned the two most important points of the CSO. I said it twice, and I'm saying it for the third time. That is to keep gifts to a minimum, and gifts should be exchanged between organizations, not individuals. Those 2 points should be easy to remember. The spirit should be easy to remember, but you do not agree those are the key points in the CSO in relation to bestowing of gifts. Now, do you know what I'm talking about? Mr. Tong, the member is giving the so-called fourth opportunity for me to answer the question. If I don't give the answer the member expects, it doesn't mean that I haven't tried my best to answer the question. On these 2 points about keeping the gift to the minimum, as a policy is a spirit. The convention, before I assumed office, yes, there was the convention, and gifts were still bestowed. It doesn't mean that we were not going in that direction, but what do you mean by keeping to a minimum? Different people at different times may have different standards. And for exchanges between organizations, exchanges of gifts between organizations as the basic principle of our operation. In public events, I gave gifts to counterpart organizations. All these were recorded. There's no room for ambiguity. But, Mr. Chairman, I must agree to one point also mentioned in the PAC on the choice of individual gifts, whether there was caution. I agree there was inadequacy. Mr. Chairman, like the tiger sculpture or the ram sculpture, $4,000, $2,000, and so on. Do you think they are appropriate in your understanding of the CSO? Would you say they are not of minimum value? How many more questions do you have, Mr. Jay? I'm still on the first question because Mr. Tong is still beating around the bush. He could never dare to confirm whether it's policy or the standing practice. And he uses the term to his own convenience. So whatever it is, policy or standing rules, do you know the spirit of that? Have you complied with it? That's all. Well, I think he's answered the question, just that maybe he couldn't satisfy you with his answer. Anyway, I think you've used up your time. I'll let him answer one more time. Mr. Chairman, my answer may not be to the liking of the member. Depends on the purpose of the question, whether he wants me to say something he wants or whether he allows me to answer the question. Now, allow me to explain this clearly about the CSO. Here, we are talking about the ICAC rules. Let me find it. 0903 breakdown is 08. It says to keep exchange of gifts to a minimum. This is the policy in the CSO. The word used is policy. Is in the part on amending the regulations. Now, what the member said was, if it could not be avoided, then the bestowing of gifts should be between organizations. Again, is in the same part. I refer to a different part. Now, I do not know the CSO like the back of my hand. There's another part, 204. 2504-010. Members, if you're interested, you could refer to it. That is, if you are treated to a reception, and then you could give gifts. What is the basis? The basis could reflect the spirit at the time. Is about the social norm at the time. I don't think there's a Chinese translation. So it's about the social norm. That's the words in black and white in the rules. And what's the reality? I wouldn't say it for a fifth time. Before I assumed office in 2007, after 1996, was it the case that no gifts were exchanged? When I assumed office, well, to be specific, about the Tiger, right? Or the Hong Kong skyline model, for the same items, gifts given by the department, the value, I'm not sure, several $1,000s. For the single most expensive item given by the department, I think it was given by the department, it was not a commission-wide gift. If you want to count dollars and cents. But anyway, the understanding at the time was consistent. It's not just the understanding of the former commissioner himself alone. Now, whether there are rules or not, sorry, even if you give me 5 opportunities, I will have to say this. Please refer to the response of the commissioner. I think it was in his statement to the panel on security in May 2013 is a GEN document that there were no specific provisions on bestowing gifts, so that's in black and white.
Just to supplement, Commissioner, if you were given a chance to reflect this point, whether it's from the administration branch, Ms. Guan or Ms. Julie Mu from the CRD, they gave answers which were very different from yours. They believed that the rules apply to the bestowing of gifts, and these rules were binding. And there were problems when you were in office, simply because it was all a mess stemming from your answer. And let me respond. This is a comment. As far as I heard just now, this is his comment, and this is a comment that I cannot agree with. And I think I need to respond to this comment. And let me read it out. On the receipt of gifts, the ICAC has not made any express provisions on the amount of gifts to be bestowed. It only depends on the occasion, the meaning of the gifts, and the standing of the guests. And yet, after the review, there were such rules. There weren't before the review. Now, as we told Mr. Tong, this hearing should be adjourned at 12:30. We have 4 members wishing to ask questions in the second round, including myself as well, Mr. Dennis Kwok, Ms. Sid Ho, Mr. Gary Chen, and Mr. James To. Now, let's see if you agree with this idea. Can Mr. Tong stay until 1, and then we can extend the hearing to 1 o'clock? And what about members? Well, it may be worthwhile for Mr. Tong to come here to spare him from coming here another time. But I also have questions to ask in the second round. We definitely cannot finish all the questions before 1, and some other members would like to ask more questions as well. So it may be more appropriate to schedule for another hearing because we can't finish before 1 anyway. Dr. Lang? Chairman? Members should be allowed to ask questions. Chairman, you should be consistent. If there are conclusions from the PAC report already, we should save time. It's difficult to find questions to ask at this select committee. I'm trying to find time to deal with these matters. Mr. James To, I don't think time is sufficient, and we've identified points which the PAC or the IRC haven't touched upon, and there are questions on these points. So I don't think it will end before 1. So it seems on the time arrangements, I've sought views from members. What about Mr. Tong? Now, as you have heard, some members talked about another hearing, and you'll be invited. And as I mentioned, I mentioned just now that I wish to extend the meeting, but I don't think I will proceed with it because we still have 4 members and still and several minutes have lapsed. And I think that so far I have not raised or stop any members to ask any questions based on the content of the question. The focus is that questions should be put to the witness in attendance, Mr. Tong, instead of making personal comments. So, Dr. Leung, I did not favor anyone and allow questions to be asked by some members and not others. So I just want to clarify. Well, many were making comments, and you didn't stop them. When I asked the ICAC commissioner, I asked the final question whether he agreed to that. Well, I shall not argue with you, Dr. Leung, as I reminded members, I reminded Ms. Sitho as well. I just wish to remind members to note this point. I also like to respond since you raised this point, Chairman. Members, of course, would like to make comments. It's no harm for them to make a brief comment. And Mr. Paul Chair, you also made some comments just now, and I did not object. And let me respond as well. I think we all know whether we are being fair. I asked specific questions. I, unlike Dr. Priscilla Leung, did not talk about my own personal experience. So let's not waste time. This is a public hearing. Please do not. Well, I talked about my own personal experience in the past because I am familiar with exchanges in the mainland. As for whether in the future review, discretions should be limited or expanded so as to avoid being impolite to mainland officials. And I don't agree with Mr. Porcher as well. He often makes remarks on the conduct of other members. I don't wish to have an argument here, and I made it clear that the discussion on this issue should come to an end. So we have some time left. Mr. Dennis Kwok, 5 minutes. Just now, you admitted that during your mainland duty visits, you had dinner and had wine with these officials on entertainment functions, and public money was involved. Is that right, Mr. Tong? I don't recall for dinner banquets on public money whether those invited involved somebody related to the CPPCC. The simple answer might be yes, but I need to elaborate on it, that for guests invited, they might be direct counterpart authorities, but some of them might also be CPPCC members at the same time. And some ICAC officers were also present. Is that right, Mr. Tong? Now, when we talk about official entertainment functions on the account of public money, I believe so, but I need to refer to records to verify that. Mr. Tong, no problem. My question is, when you were the commissioner of the ICAC, did you believe that this would be the last public office you held? When you talked about public office, if you mean full-time public office, any public office? No. When I was the ICAC Commissioner, I did not consider my arrangements after retirement. But I want to point out that for principal officials or ICAC Commissioner appointed by the Chief Executive to chair a certain committee, those were also public offices as well. But I did not consider it at the time. So it never occurred to you any appointment of public office after your retirement as ICAC Commissioner? No. Mr. Kwok, do you know when you had meals and dinners and wine with these CPPCC delegates, whether they had the authority to recommend anyone to become CPPCC delegates? Mr. Tong, now, during official entertainment functions, nothing was mentioned about CPPCC matters. No, that's not my question. Mr. Tong, please answer my question. Do you know whether these CPPCC members attending had the authority to recommend others to be appointed as delegates? My simple answer is I never considered whether anyone had the authority to make recommendations to become CPPCC delegates. That's not part of my consideration. My question is, do you know or not? Because just now in your answer you said you had entertainment functions with these CPPCC delegates which were public money funded, and my question is whether when you had meals and had wine with these delegates, did you know or not whether they had the authority to appoint others to become CPPCC delegates? Mr. Tong, it never occurred to me anything about any recommendations to become CPPCC delegates. It never occurred in my mind whether they had the authority or not. If you want a yes or no answer from me, then my answer would be no. I did not know. But actually, it never occurred to me, not at all. So you did not know. So to answer your question, I did not know, because this was not related to my official business. So you had no idea that these CPPCC delegates had the authority to recommend other people to be appointed. It never occurred to me. I didn't know, and I don't even know now whether they have the authority to do so. So, during your duty visits in the mainland, had you ever been told about your arrangements after you retire as the ICAC commissioners? Now, on retirement matters and what will happen in the future, I cannot give you a blanket answer. As for what life after retirement, I can't exclude the possibility of this happening, that I ever talked about it, be it NPC or CPPCC delegates. I never talked about it. So, Mr. Tong, when you knew that CPPCC delegates were present and like you said, cannot rule out the possibility of talking about arrangements after your retirement, then on the bestowing of gifts, wine consumption, meal gatherings, did it occur to you that these arrangements might be related to your arrangements after retirement? Well, I should not speculate. First of all, I will not discuss with anyone my arrangements after retirement. If being asked, what happened after my retirement, I just cannot rule out the possibility of talking about it. If people ask me, I mean, if somebody asks me where I would live after retirement, and that's part of the arrangement. As for work arrangement, that's another matter. I cannot recall on any occasion any discussion relating to the arrangement of public office after retirement, or not even NPC or CPPCC delegates. No such discussion, as the member put it. If you don't have any thing else to supplement, we should adjourn this hearing at 12:30, and we've passed 12:30, and I have to adjourn this hearing now, and I'd like to thank Mr. Tong for accepting our invitation to attend this hearing. Mr. Tong, if necessary, the Select Committee may invite you to attend the hearing again. So just a reminder, Chairman, may I be allowed to give a brief response, 2 minutes? Do we accept this? We're not. This is not the conclusion of the hearing. I believe Mr. Tong has misunderstood that this is the conclusion. I asked for a minute or two to speak. Mr. To, I think the arrangement is we ask questions, he answers questions. He has already given lengthened answers. And in the beginning, he already made some opening remarks. So this is for the purpose of taking evidence. Now, Mr. Tong, you made the request, but since we have passed 12:30, so if Mr. Tong, you really want to make such requests, so please reconsider whether you wish to do so. But anyway, we are likely to invite you to come again. So do you still insist on this request that you be given some time to speak? As a witness coming on your invitation to attend this hearing, may I be allowed half a minute to seek advice from my counsel? I just ask for speaking time of 1 minute. This is not a concluding remarks. I would like to give a message, and I would like to seek advice first before deciding whether we should have some time to speak.
For this hearing, is for questions to be answered. We allowed Mr. Tong sufficient time to answer our questions. If Mr. Tong has any personal remarks to make, he could tell the media when he meets with them. And it would be better for us to find out about the personal feelings of Mr. Timothy Tong through the media. It's more appropriate. He shouldn't be speaking or making remarks when no questions are asked. Yes, I think members have already expressed their views. I have made this clear. Now, Mr. Tong, you asked for half a minute to consult your lawyer. I'll allow you that, but I think you've heard the members' views clearly. Okay. Mr. Chairman, yes, Mr. Tong. Having consulted with my legal advisor, I believe I should make the request. I'm not trying to sum up questions that have been answers to questions, but rather I would like to give you my personal wish. 1 minute. I want to convey my personal wish to the Select Committee. Well, I've heard members' views, but since the witness has made the request, there's no way I could decline the request. But 1 minute, okay? Mr. Tong. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the start of the hearing, I pointed out the Public Accounts Committee had very, very detailed discussion, and there was also investigation by other committees. Now, for the information I could provide, I have tried my best to provide. And today, in some of the exchanges, like I was given 4 opportunities, but the questions asked and the answers given were not the different. And I believe there is very limited room for the provision of new information to this select committee. I know this is a public hearing. I'm saying this in public. Now, I have left the office for a long time. So in terms of my preparation for the meeting, and because I do not have the support of any organization, and every time I come to a meeting, it takes me a lot of effort to make the preparation. I hope the Select Committee appreciates that. I believe I have very limited room to contribute further. Thank you. That's the end of the hearing today. Thank you for coming. For the next hearing, it will be held on the 1st of March, 9 a.m. Members, please note that. Thank you, Mr. Tong. And those accompany you. Can I ask members to go to conference room 4? That will be the closed session of the Select Committee. Thank you.